Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the It Depends podcast. As always, I am your host. My name is Kevin Goldsmith. I am the author of It Depends, Writing on Technology Leadership from 2012 to 2022. I am also a CTO and have been a CTO now for 8 years, but have been from developer to lead to engineering manager and all the way up through the chain over 30 plus years in the industry. And on this podcast, we serialize the audiobook of It Depends. So every episode, every other week, you get a new chapter from the book, and those chapters are in order. If you're new and you haven't heard this, there's also a newsletter. The newsletter comes out on the weeks that the podcast doesn't. That is also serializing the text of the book, but not in order. And the book is a collection of things I've written over critical 10 years of my career. So in 2012, I was a engineering leader, senior engineering manager. I think maybe at that point I'd already been promoted to director, but it was right after. If so, it was right after being promoted to director at Adobe, leading a team there. 2013, I left Adobe, went to Spotify, started as a director, became a VP, left Spotify and became a CTO, and then have been a CTO since. So these are articles that are capturing not only that growth and also my introduction to being an executive and managing managers, but also it's capturing some of the lessons I learned from before. So it's speaking to different levels of engineering leaders. And so this is just a set of lessons and a set of advice and things I'd wanted to share more easily, consumably. If you're interested in the book, if you haven't gotten it already, the book is available. The links to all the different stores the book's available from and the audiobook, and you can get ebook, print, hardcover, softcover, the whole thing, is at itdependsbook.net. So that's where you can get more information about the book. You can get links to the different stores and stuff. Also links to the newsletter. And that is linked from the show notes. You'll see that link in the show notes. If you have questions, if you have comments, please send them to me. Contact at itdependsbook.net. If you prefer to send things over Twitter or Threads, I'm Kevin Goldsmith on both of those things. I'm also on Mastodon, Blue Sky, Instagram, wherever. That's fine. LinkedIn. You can send me a message on LinkedIn as well. For those of you who made it to Leading Edge last week in New York City, I did meet a few of you who listened to the podcast. They were kind enough to arrange a book signing, and that was my first time really doing something like that, which was really cool. It was weird to see a line of people and have them come up and do that thing, which I've done. I've been in those lines before. This is my first time doing it, and that was pretty awesome. The conference itself was great. As always, the White October people who put on Leading Edge and Lead Dev, and I forget what their Staff Eng one is called, might be called Staff Eng. They just do great conferences. I've spoken at so many of them. I've just really appreciated the quality that they have in their conferences over the years. I gave the closing keynote called Director to CTO Path, How to Follow It, How to Mentor It. I do plan on actually writing that up as an article and sharing that when I get some time, and that could mean anything. I'll let you know here or in the newsletter when that happens, or if you subscribe to my blog, which is blog.kevingoldsmith.com, or Medium, where I'm Kevin Goldsmith, medium.com/whatever, at Kevin Goldsmith. You can find that there. So that's how you find new stuff. Because of the book and promoting the book, I haven't been writing as much, but I'm starting to write again. So there'll be some new stuff more this year. This episode, we're covering the second chapter in the 4-part series on doing performance reviews. And so the one from the last episode was assembling the data and preparing for the review. This chapter is all about, now you have that assembled data, how do you go through the data and then write the review? And reading the chapter again before recording, when I do these podcasts, I like to give information outside of the chapter that augments what I say in it. So you get a little bit additional perspective, a little bit of the director's cut, if you will. I'm actually, I put a lot of work into these 4 chapters. And so rereading it, I'm like, I think I did a pretty good job here. Is there something specifically that I didn't cover or I've thought about since I want to do differently or I want to add a different spin on? And honestly, there isn't. So I was trying to think, well, what can I do to add a little bit more information outside that chapter? And I was trying to think through, as I mentioned, so in the last 14 years, I've been at several, I was at Adobe, I'd spent 9 years at Adobe, I was at Spotify, as a bunch of different companies. And before that, like Microsoft and things like that. And I was trying to think through the different review processes because pretty much every company has their own. And you see me in the chapter trying to not assume any particular single review process. And I was thinking back to like, so what was the best and what was the worst I've seen? The best I've seen might have been what we were doing at Avo when I joined as CTO there. We did twice yearly reviews. One was a more formal kind of manager-led review. The other was a less formal kind of mid-year review that was a check-in, but leaned a lot more on peer reviews. We do something somewhat similar today at DistroKid, where I work now. But that actually, we took it seriously, but not so seriously. So it wasn't too high pressure, but people took it seriously and tried to do a good job, which inspired me as a manager to really put a lot of energy into it. When I was CTO at Amphito, we had something somewhat similar. So it's maybe kind of the new thing. A lot of companies are adopting this sort of formal end of year review and kind of less formal, more peer driven mid year review. That I've seen that work fairly well. A lot of it depends on how the company takes it and wants to implement it and how much pressure there is around the process. But that was the kind of best of give you reasonable, actionable feedback, and then also not put too much pressure on it and not explode it into too big of a process that everyone's really miserable about. The worst process I've seen it by a mile goes to Microsoft. And this is not Microsoft currently. I am positive they do something very different now. But Microsoft in the 90s, where I was a manager and it was still under Bill. It was a very different company than it was under Steve, where I was there when Steve was there as well. I haven't been there under Satya, but I've heard it's very different now. I would hope. But that process was an extremely competitive process. And that made a lot of sense with the culture of Microsoft at the time, because the culture of Microsoft at the time was a very competitive culture. Teams competed, individuals competed within teams, divisions competed for resources, for projects, all of that. And I saw that a lot when I worked there. I worked there 8 years. And so I front and center at every level. How did those fights get solved? Bill would solve them. And it would be Bill that solved them. And that came down into the review process itself. And the way it did it is we had forced distributions. Now, distributions within an organization, there's a logical distribution. And I talk about in this chapter, I say, well, not everybody in your team can be exceeding expectations. That's more a statement about you as a manager not being able to judge than it is about the individuals in your team. Not everyone in your team can be not meeting expectations. There has to be a reasonable distribution. That is something I certainly look for when I review my organizations in different companies is do we have what I would expect to be a reasonable distribution, which is some people are exceeding, some people aren't meeting, and the vast majority are somewhere in between these two things. But it isn't reasonable to force the distribution because that's also not the case. Maybe your team doesn't have somebody that's not meeting expectations. Maybe your team doesn't have somebody that's exceeding expectations, and that's okay. And also, that distribution only makes sense in the macro. right? When you're looking out across 20, 30, 40, 50 plus people. Even at 20, it's a little bit tougher, but it's reasonable. At Microsoft, it was at every level. So down to a team of 4 or 5, somebody had to exceed, somebody had to not. And that was not a choice I was given. This is the way it has to be, which didn't make any sense to me at all. And in fact, teams did completely stupid things to make that work, meaning they would keep around low performers just so that they had somebody that they could ding. The new person on the team, no matter how great they were doing, guess what? First review, you always get dinged. People on the team would not help each other. They would undercut each other because they knew they were competing for that maybe one spot on the team that was overperforming. Because also at that time, Microsoft had a number system, like you were assigned a number based on your performance. And that number dictated salary increase, new stock options. So it was financial. The perverse incentives were very perverse. And it created all kind of havoc within the company. It was a large company, obviously a successful company. So it didn't destroy the company, but it's certainly, if you were good at playing that game, you did great. I was never good at playing that game. I did okay. But one of the reasons I didn't stay at Microsoft, I have lots of friends who did, but one of the reasons I didn't is I realized I am never going to be successful here because the things I need to do to become successful are not who I am and not who I want to be. And by the way, my friends who did stay didn't necessarily do that either, but they were willing to make the trade-offs or whatever. For me, it was just such a culture that I just could not be happy in. And so I left. But that was by far the worst review process I've ever experienced. And in companies since, I've seen HR leaders decide we're being too easy with reviews, or we're not. When you give everybody about the same score, that's peanut buttering. We're peanut buttering everything. We really want to identify our high performers and reward them appropriately. And we really do need to identify the folks who are just not doing well and either help them or move them along. And so they come back to these strict quantitative type review processes, and then they try to adopt something like, often, at least in my case, where an HR leader proposes, try to adopt like a Microsoft style, like Microsoft 90s style review process to kind of force, no, we must identify our high and low performers without understanding like all the perverse incentives that go with it. And in a couple companies where this has come up, I've been able to basically put the kibosh on it and felt very happy I was able to do that. But I've seen other companies adopt it and they have the exact same problems. It's like nobody learned this lesson at all, which is sad. What do you do if you are a manager in one of these companies? I don't know anybody who's still doing it. If your company is, please drop me a line and tell me, because that's interesting to me, because I don't hear about it as much. Maybe we've moved on as an industry. But if somebody's promoting or proposing this, I talk a lot in the book about being deliberate and being thoughtful and thinking through things. And a lot of that is what happens if we implement this policy? What happens if we implement this rule? What happens if we implement this system architecture? It seems like a good idea, but let's follow this down the next several steps and start to think about what possible side effects it could have. And a lot of times people look at, well, Microsoft did it and it works great for them. They were the most wealthy company in the world. But that doesn't mean they retain employees well or people are happy there or whatever. So it is often like thinking through things. But if you do work in a company like this with this thing, so how do you survive it? I can't give you great advice because I basically opted out and said, this isn't for me and moved on. You can decide, like either you figure out how to play that game well. You keep around a low performer so you can ding them every review cycle. You pick and choose your high performers to give it to the person who's earned it by working the hardest this time around. However you need to do it, that is how you play that game. If you're an individual on a team or if you're even a manager and you're going against other managers, You figure out how to make your team look better than the other teams, because that's what you have to do. There's only one person that's going to get that high score. But honestly, from my own experience, I would say get out of there, because unless you're already really good at it, you're probably not going to get good at it. And if you've been there a while and you've been doing all right, well, you've figured out enough how to play the game. But if you're there and you're struggling, this is not the place for you. That was my decision. And I say I worked there 8 years, so it took me a while to figure this out. So I hope you don't mind my spilling the tea a little bit on performance review processes as a way to give some more value around this chapter. But as I said, I read through this chapter. I'm actually pretty proud of it. I think I captured a lot of not only my own actual process and how I write reviews once I've assembled the data, but also at some level, some of the things I want to do more of, or I do a little bit, but would like to do more. It is an involved process. The thing I talk about in these 4 chapters, it's a pretty involved process. And again, it's a thing of, for the people that work for you, isn't it worth spending a few hours to really give them valuable and useful feedback? A few hours out of your year, they work hard all year. The least we can do for them is to show them that we are paying attention and that we care and that we take the time to do this. But I also understand, it's a lot. It's a lot. And you have to reserve time to do it. And oftentimes that may mean like you have to push stuff out of your calendar so that you can really focus on these. And a lot of times people make that mistake where they don't push enough out. They don't really block out the time. Even though they know the reviews are coming, they try and do everything else they're trying to do. And so they end up doing night, evenings, and weekends. And I've certainly done it. I talked about it in the intro to the last chapter. So I've certainly made that mistake, but I definitely do try and take this time and make sure I'm being as unbiased as I possibly can be so that I do the right thing for the people that work for me. So we're in September now. If you're now starting to collect the data and going back maybe to the beginning of whatever your review period is, middle of the year, beginning of the year, and starting to collect that data, or at least just trying to get the data from now on and preparing for the reviews that are going to come in a couple months for end of year. This chapter is about how you now take that data and do something useful with it. And also to think about how that unconscious bias creeps into that in review writing process, identify it, and avoid it. So here now is writing useful performance reviews, evaluating the data, and writing the review. Writing useful performance reviews, evaluating the data, and writing the review. Originally published on December 11th, 2021. Once you have assembled the data, you are ready to write the review. Have everything ready before you begin writing. Before you begin to write your review, make sure you have the role and level definition for the person's current role and level. You should also have the description for the job at the next level. If you have followed my suggestions in the previous chapter, you have the folder with earlier reviews, notes from one-on-ones and project meetings, the peer feedback, the person's self-evaluation, and your notes on the work output. Your company's performance review form and supporting process documentation are necessary as well. Review your documentation. If you have followed my advice from the last chapter, you have assembled a large amount of data. You will now go through it all to evaluate the person's performance relative to the standard. You may find it beneficial to highlight essential information in the documents as you review them, or copy-paste them into a new file for easy reference. If you can, do your review in one sitting. This process helps you build an understanding of the person's performance. You are creating a context with as much data as possible, so keeping it in your near-term memory is beneficial. If you don't have enough time to do this in one sitting, or think you may be interrupted, take good notes so you can review after a break. As you read over the data, you should be consciously building a narrative of the review period. Each person will have some highs and lows, but patterns of performance should emerge. After reviewing the data, you should have one or two specific messages to convey to the person about their performance. That is the goal of the accumulation and evaluation. Start with the review form. First, read through the review form, making sure you understand the expectation for each question. Then, if you are in doubt, use the company documentation on the process. Get clarification from your HR partner if necessary. Understand the role level definitions. Make sure you understand the person's role expectations at the current level and the next level. The current level documentation covers the performance expectations the person should meet now. The next level documentation is helpful for you to recognize performance beyond expectations. Go over any previous reviews. Read all the previous reviews the person has received at the company in chronological order. This review will help you see patterns and trends and goals met and missed. The essential evaluations are the most recent, especially any from the last couple of years. Take extra care reading these to remind yourself of prior performance discussions, if you wrote them, and understand the current development areas. What if you disagree with the assessments and reviews written by their previous manager? Suppose the person is new to your team or you are a new lead for an existing group. In that case, occasionally you will read prior reviews and realize that the previous manager used a very different approach to performance than your own. Ideally, everyone is evaluating against the company's career pathing rubric, but sometimes it is applied differently. In this case, you may need to prepare for some challenging conversations. You might choose to treat this review cycle as a transitional one, giving people time to adjust to your management style. If you do that, make sure they understand how future reviews will work differently. Read through your notes from your review of email or messaging exchanges. Scanning through your messages from the review period will help remind you of any events, successes, or challenges that you may have forgotten about during the review period. Study the work output to understand the person's contributions to their projects. A reminder from the previous chapter. A person's code contributions do not reflect the sum of their contributions. Senior developers may contribute less code because they are more efficient or spend time helping other people. Look at code reviews, bug notes, documentation, architectural decision records, or anything else that will demonstrate contributions to the team's projects. You're probably arriving at some opinions at this point. By this point, you will have started to build a narrative, identified some possible key discussion topics, and formed opinions on the person's performance. You likely started the process with ideas already, based on your interactions with the person over the review period. The views you bring at the start of the process aren't necessarily incorrect. Still, they may be untrustworthy because of recency bias, giving more weight to recent events, affinity bias, a tendency to prefer people similar to us or someone we know, or the person being very good at promoting their accomplishments or taking credit for others' work. Now you will start to review the more subjective data. Does what you find conflict with or reinforce your existing viewpoint? Review the peer evaluations. Peer evaluations can be problematic. First, they can be tempting to cheat for people by giving the chance to collude with their peers. Second, many people don't want to criticize their coworkers. Third, they may worry about how their comments reflect on themselves. For these reasons, you want to read between the lines when reading peer evaluations. As you read through the peer comments, look for examples that support or challenge the narrative you have been building. If you find many things that challenge your message, you may reevaluate your opinions. Read the self-evaluation last. When people are evaluated based on something they produce, they naturally tend to create a narrative that accentuates their positive contributions and minimizes their negative ones. It isn't necessarily deceptive, it is human nature. Therefore, I always read the self-evaluations last. I don't want it to influence how I evaluate all the other data. However, the self-evaluation is still relevant because it is the person's view of how things have gone, their side of the story. There are a few things I always look for when reading this document. Are there good explanations for some challenges they had during the review period? How aware are they of their challenges and strengths? Are there any comments that might be relevant for the reviews of others on the team? Where are they interested in growing? Finally, is there anything you can do to support them better in the following review period? Now, write the review. Having reviewed all the data, you are now ready to write the review. You have one or two messages for your narrative as well as the data to support it. Be clear. One of the biggest mistakes people make when writing a review is trying not to be too negative or too positive. Particularly problematic is using the compliment sandwich, surrounding a criticism with compliments, or vague language to avoid a challenging conversation when delivering the evaluation. Another mistake is creating a balanced review by overemphasizing small challenges or successes to offset a too positive or negative narrative. When someone reads your review, they want to know if they're doing well or not doing well. If the person doesn't know after reading the evaluation, it is not helpful to them. In addition, they should have a clear connection between their review and their salary adjustment. They can't all be extraordinary. Often I see inexperienced or poorly trained managers produce reviews for their teams that are uniformly good. Everyone on the team is doing great, they say. However, even on the highest performing teams, some members will contribute more than others during a review period. Universally positive reviews are a signal that the manager is either not promoting team members, so they are all overperforming relative to their level, not paying attention, they are missing things, not challenging the individuals on the team, or setting their expectations too low. Exclusively positive reviews are a signal about the quality of the manager more than the quality of the team. Yes, you can have a great team where everyone is contributing well. However, each person still has strengths and weaknesses compared to the role or level rubric. You need to understand that you aren't doing your duty to your team or the company if you don't evaluate people objectively. Suppose you want to emphasize that the individuals on your team are outperforming individuals on other teams, often crucial if your organization stack ranks, creating a forced distribution of employee ratings. Make that point in the accomplishments noted for each team member. Rating your team universally high just looks like you are trying to game the system. They don't all suck. Something I see less often is a manager rating their team uniformly poorly, usually when a new manager joins an existing group. When I see this, I wonder if the manager is trying to make a statement about the team they inherited, if they are setting the initial base level low so they can show improvement, or if they are setting the bar way too high. As with overly positive reviews, this behavior often is more indicative of the issues with the manager than the team. If you find yourself compelled to give poor ratings to the entire team, challenge yourself to defend your ratings by comparing each person's accomplishments against the rubric. Are you being too harsh in your judgment, or can you justify each of the ratings? Use a 5 whys exercise for each person's rating. Do you find unique cases for each person's poor performance, or does it all come back to you? Use the data collected and analyzed in your review. As you fill out the form, answer each question to support your message for the recipient. Answer each question with a statement, then provide data that supports your answer. Avoid phrases that ascribe intent to a person's actions. Instead, speak to what they did and the measurable effect it had. Do not use expressions like, I think, or it seems. These phrases show a subjective interpretation. You want to ground your assessment in facts. Being fact-based avoids any disputes about the review if the person does not like the result. Provide a plan to help underperformers. Identifying areas of growth for someone is helpful for them. However, if you're being straightforward, a review for someone underperforming can be demotivating. Rather than finding positive things to balance the assessment at the risk of making it less forthright, you should focus on how it will help the person address their performance issues. If the performance is so poor that the person will be put on a performance improvement plan, be specific on what they need to change to move off of the PIP. Provide next steps for growth for the people performing well. What are the next steps for those on your team who are overperforming against their role and level? What opportunities can you identify for them? What new responsibilities? Are they on a path for promotion? Where should they focus on continuing their growth? People who are doing well aren't usually satisfied with being recognized for their work, although it is imperative to acknowledge their work. They want to know what is next for them. They want more responsibility, more challenge. They want to expand their skills. How will you help them do that in the next review period? They will want to know. There is nothing wrong with just doing the job. Most of your team will not be underperforming or overperforming. They will be doing their jobs well. The work that these folks do is essential. They are how the team's work gets done. Recognize their strengths and weaknesses and tell them how you will support both. Some are happy to continue to deliver solid performance, and unless your company has an up or out culture, this is fine. People will have natural ebbs and flows in their careers. If the person is ambitious, focus on opportunities for their growth and be clear on what overperforming requires. The company's career pathing rubric is a reference to show them what is needed. When you have written all the performance reviews, reread them. Once you've completed all the performance appraisals, go back and review them. Look for patterns in your assessments. Look for potential unconscious bias. Try to read them as your manager or some future manager of the person would. Are you providing enough information to justify your statements? As this process can take a long time, does it seem that you put less effort into later reviews when you got tired? Before submitting them to your review system, make sure that you are happy with them individually and as a group. If you have time, you may want to wait a few days after writing the last review before you reread them to give yourself some space. If your review process includes a grade ranking or 9-box classification, ensure that your performance reviews support where you put each person. Also look to see that the distribution of rankings or grades makes sense. For example, are your recommendations so clustered that it doesn't seem like you are using good judgment? Does your review justify your choices? Now that you have written your reviews, be ready with your raise recommendations. In some companies, salary change recommendations are part of the performance review writing process. It runs as a separate process in other companies, usually near the performance review process on the calendar. Line managers do not have direct input into compensation changes at some companies. However compensation changes work at your company, it is good to understand how to make compensation decisions and recommendations for your team. That is the subject of the next chapter. I hope you got something valuable from that chapter, found it useful. Again, if you would like to get the book where you get all the chapters all at once, you can go to itdependsbook.net and the links are all there. This episode, I don't have anything else immediate that I'm promoting for myself beyond obviously the podcast, the newsletter, the book. But for those of you, I will be attending the Business of Software conference in a couple of weeks. And if you're going to be there, let me know. I'd be really interested in meeting up with any of you that are there or in the Raleigh-Durham area and don't mind coming downtown. Reach out to me. As I said, my name's Kevin Goldsmith on Twitter, Threads. I'm KMG at Mastodon Social. But you can also send me mail, contact at itdependsbook.net, and would love to meet up with you if you're going to be around there in a couple of weeks. Have a great week, and I'll see you next time. See you in the newsletter next week. Thanks so much for listening. Please, again, subscribe, rate, share episodes of this podcast on your favorite podcast app. Thank you for Answers to April for the music used in this podcast. To hear more from Answers to April, visit answerstoapril.com. This podcast is a production of Unit Circle Media.